The courtroom laughed. They laughed because the one speaking was just a boy. They laughed because the promise seemed impossible. They laughed because it was easier to dismiss than to listen. But what if I told you that, that day, the laughter was the biggest mistake in that room? What if I told you that a 10-year-old child was carrying a secret powerful enough to bring down a powerful man, expose an entire system, and free a mother unjustly in handcuffs? This is not just a courtroom story. It is a story about forced silence, blackmail disguised as authority, and how the truth often comes from where no one expects it. Because while adults argued over laws, titles, and reports, a boy watched everything in silence, waiting for the one moment when no one could pretend they hadn't seen. What seemed like an affront became proof. What sounded absurd turned into panic. And the promise that made the courtroom laugh became the most disturbing moment of that hearing. Stay until the end, because what happens after the impossible begins doesn't just change this verdict. It changes the way you will see power, justice, and courage. And if you enjoy real, intense stories full of twists that expose hidden truths, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any of them. The judge's gavel was still echoing when the air in the courtroom changed. People stopped moving without realizing it. The usual murmur of a courtroom simply vanished. No coughs, no whispers, no hurried footsteps. It was in that emptiness that a child's voice cut through the room. It wasn't loud, but it carried something strange, something that didn't match his age. Everyone turned their heads at the same time. The boy was standing, far too small for that place, and yet he was impossible to ignore. Noah gripped the hem of his own shirt tightly. His fingers trembled, but his eyes did not look away. He stared straight ahead like someone who had already decided everything. The bench where he had been sitting seemed far too big. His feet barely touched the cold floor. Even so, he took a step forward. Each movement felt heavier than the last. The sound of his simple sneakers echoed across the marble. Some jurors exchanged uneasy glances. No one understood why the silence continued. The judge frowned, irritated, not by the interruption but by the stolen attention. This was not a place for children to speak, much less for promises. Noah took a deep breath before opening his mouth again. His chest rose quickly as if he were short of air. He swallowed hard, like someone conquering fear. And then he said something that defied all logic. The words fell heavily onto the courtroom floor. And no one knew how to react right away. The promise came out plain, without embellishment, without a tone of challenge or playfulness. It sounded like a fact, not a hope. Some thought they had heard wrong. Others laughed silently to themselves. A child didn't make promises like that. Not in that context. Even so, no one dared to interrupt. There was something wrong, out of place, and everyone's body felt it before their mind did. Noah didn't shout, didn't cry. He spoke like someone who had rehearsed, like someone who had repeated it in his thoughts many times. His gaze didn't seek approval, nor pity. It sought attention. It sought time. As if he knew he would have only one moment, and that he needed to use every second. The silence remained obedient. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth. Another man crossed his arms tightly. The distant creak of a chair broke the air. But no one said a word. The boy remained there, motionless, small before the suited adults, small before a massive system, and yet strangely steady. The promise hovered in the air like an invisible challenge, and no one knew how to deal with it. The judge took a deep breath, preparing the reprimand that he had already decided it would end there. Just another confused child. Just another moment to be forgotten. But something made him hesitate. Maybe the boy's eyes, maybe the conviction in his voice, maybe the general discomfort in the room. He delayed his reaction by a few precious seconds. And those seconds would change everything. Noah didn't wait for permission. He didn't ask to continue. He simply held his gaze forward as if he knew he would be interrupted soon. His body looked tense, braced for impact, like someone about to fall, but who refuses to step back. The promise still echoed in everyone's ears. Something far too big for a child to say. Something far too dangerous to ignore, and the courtroom seemed trapped in that moment. Some laughed softly, trying to break the tension. Others pretended to write something that didn't exist. The discomfort grew like an invisible weight. It was easier to laugh than to listen, easier to dismiss than to question. Noah saw that in their faces, but he didn't retreat. He seemed to know that laughter was a shield, and that behind it was fear, fear of what might come next. The silence settled again, thicker as if the entire courtroom were holding its breath. The promise no longer sounded merely absurd. It sounded inconvenient. It sounded threatening to those who believed they controlled everything. The judge finally shifted in his chair, preparing to act. And Noah, as if he had foreseen it, shifted his gaze. He was no longer looking at the judge. He was staring at someone specific, opening a path for what was yet to be revealed. The judge slammed the gavel with excessive force. Authority needed to be restored immediately. That moment had already gone beyond what was acceptable that he ordered the child to be removed from the courtroom. His voice sounded firm, trained to shut down uncomfortable situations. Two security guards moved almost at the same time. Protocol followed its natural course. That it was just another unwanted interruption. Nothing there should continue, but Noah didn't move. Before anyone could touch him, his voice burst out, not in volume but in urgency. That he shouted a name that tore through the air. A name heavy with emotional weight. Cecilia, handcuffed, sitting there for hours. The sound of the name made heads turn instantly. Some people flinched without knowing why. Others held their breath. That name had history in that case. Cecilia looked up at the same instant. The shock on her face was immediate. She hadn't expected to see him there, much less hear him shout like that. The handcuffs gleamed under the courtroom's white lights. She tried to stand on instinct, but was restrained. The desperate gesture revealed something far too human. It wasn't the expected behavior of a dangerous criminal. It was the reflex of a surprised mother, and that did not go unnoticed. Noah extended his arm with certainty. His small finger pointed straight ahead. Not at the judge, not at the security guards, but at another spot in the room. A spot no one was paying attention to. He pointed with conviction, without hesitation. As if that detail were painfully obvious. As if everyone were choosing to ignore it. Some followed the direction of his gesture, and frowned. The judge called for silence once again, but the attention had already slipped from his grasp. Eyes began to shift. Internal cameras captured the collective movement. Noah kept his arm raised, his face serious, tense, determined. He didn't explain yet, he didn't accuse directly, he simply showed. As if saying, "Look closer." Cecilia began shaking her head in denial, her eyes filled with panic. It wasn't fear of the verdict, it was fear of what her son was about to do. She whispered something no one heard. Maybe a plea, maybe a warning. Her handcuffed hands trembled. And that simple detail began to change the narrative. Dangerous criminals don't tremble like that when they see their child. A low murmur spread through the room. Not laughter but confusion. People were starting to sense the dissonance. Something didn't fit. The judge noticed the shift in the atmosphere. His expression hardened. He asked the child to calm down. Called Noah by name in a firm tone. But Noah was no longer looking at him. He was looking at his mother. Noah's finger didn't shake. His posture seemed bigger now. As if fear had been replaced by urgency. He knew he had only seconds. He knew he would be silenced soon. So he chose to show, not explain. The pointed detail was beginning to unsettle people. Some jurors whispered. A lawyer adjusted his glasses nervously. The mood was shifting too fast. The judge ordered the guards to move in again. But now there was hesitation. They had also seen what Noah was pointing at, and that created doubt. Doubt breaks authority. The room was no longer fully controllable. Cecilia began to cry silently, contained tears, no spectacle. Noah breathed fast but steady, and that simple pointing gesture opened a dangerous path for what was coming. Noah lowered his arms slowly, not in surrender, but like someone who had completed the first step. He had broken the courtroom's rhythm. He had shifted the focus. He had made everyone look where they weren't supposed to. The judge realized it too late. Something had been activated there. Something that could no longer be ignored. And the next step threatened to dismantle everything that had seemed solid until then. The prosecutor cleared his throat before speaking, as if reclaiming control. His voice sounded trained, impersonal, almost mechanical. He began repeating the terms of the case. Dangerous criminal. A risk to society. Cold, calculated behavior. The words echoed harshly, heavy. That was how Cecilia needed to be seen. Not as a person but as a label. And the courtroom seemed ready to accept it. Cecilia kept her head lowered as she listened. Her simply tied hair revealed neglect. Her face was pale, marked by exhaustion. Nothing about her matched the image being described. Even so, she remained still. Until her eyes found Noah again. It was an involuntary reflex. Her body reacted before reason. Her lower lip trembled. And something inside her broke right then. She tried to compose herself quickly. Took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a second. But it was already too late. The look of a mother had appeared. There was no calculation. There was no coldness. There was fear, love, and desperation mixed together. The kind of emotion that isn't easily staged. Some people in the gallery noticed. Others felt it without knowing how to explain it. Noah took a step forward instinctively, as if he wanted to reach her. The movement was stopped by one of the guards. But the impulse had already been seen. Cecilia stretched out her handcuffed hands. She didn't touch him. She didn't need to. The simple movement said everything. Dangerous criminals don't react like that. Mothers do. The prosecutor kept talking. But attention was no longer on the words. It was on the reactions. on the micro-gestures, on the restrained trembling, on Cecilia's uneven breathing. She no longer heard the accusation. Her focus was only one thing: her son there vulnerable. And that dismantled the official narrative. The judge watched in silence now. He didn't interrupt. His pen remained suspended over the paper. He had seen many performances. Forced tears. Rehearsed pleas. But this was different. Too raw. Too unpredictable. And for that reason, dangerous to any rigid accusation. Cecilia tried to say something. No sound came out. Her throat felt locked. She squeezed her eyes shut, as if trying to erase the scene, as if trying to protect Noah from everything, even from herself. Tears ran silently down her face, and the silence that formed was louder than any scream. The image of the dangerous criminal was beginning to collapse. Some jurors exchanged looks. Empathy wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't part of the process. But it surfaced anyway. Uncontrollable. A handcuffed woman crying for her son didn't fit. Something in this story was off balance. And the more the prosecutor spoke, the clearer it became. The accusation felt too rigid for that reality. Like a suit that didn't fit. Noah sensed the change in the room. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. But his eyes showed momentary relief. He knew that moment mattered. He knew the courtroom was seeing something new. Something human. Something hard to erase once seen. Cecilia was breathing with difficulty now. And that emotional unraveling raised a silent question. If she wasn't who they said she was, then who was she? The judge finally cleared his throat again. But this time not to impose order. It was a sound of reflection. Something inside him had been touched. He looked at Cecilia for a few seconds longer than usual, then shifted his gaze to Noah. The entire room waited for the next move. The narrative had cracked. And through that crack, something much bigger threatened to emerge. Something that would make the next laugh even crueler, and even more revealing. The silence that had formed didn't last long. It was broken by a single laugh, short, disbelieving, almost automatic. Soon another joined in, then another. Within seconds, the courtroom sounded far too human again. People needed to release the tension, and laughter was the easiest way. Laughing at the child was more comfortable. Laughing restored control. Noah didn't understand it right away. His face showed confusion before firmness. He repeated the sentence, louder this time. Not as a challenge, but as insistence, like someone trying to be heard through the noise. The words sounded the same. No irony. No bravado. And that made it all even stranger. Some now laughed openly. A lawyer shook his head in disbelief. A juror covered their mouth, trying to hide it. The sound echoed off the high walls. It was a diminishing laugh. One that placed everyone back in a position of superiority. Children don't make impossible promises, and impossible promises deserve mockery. The room reorganized itself around that idea. The judge struck the gavel with a sharp blow. Order needed to be restored. He ordered everything to be entered into the record, the child's statement, the tone, the insistence. He classified it as contempt of court, not a threat, not an argument. Contempt? Something to be dismissed, not analyzed. Noah heard that word without fully understanding it, but he understood its effect. He understood they were trying to diminish him. His shoulders stiffened, his body became more rigid, not out of anger, but focused. He took a deep breath again, like someone preparing for something bigger, and chose not to retreat. The laughter began to spread like a wave. Each laugh gave permission for another. The room grew louder. Lighter for those who laughed, heavier for those who watched. Cecilia squeezed her eyes shut, her face twisted in pain. Not from her own humiliation, but from her son's, and that detail did not go unnoticed by everyone. The prosecutor watched in silence. There was a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't joy. It was relief. As long as they laughed at Noah, no one would ask serious questions. As long as the promise sounded absurd, nothing needed to be investigated. Laughter worked like a curtain. A fragile one, but effective. At least for now. Noah seemed to sense this instinctively. He didn't cry. He didn't raise his voice beyond what was necessary. He simply held his gaze forward. As if counting time. As if he knew the laughter wouldn't last forever. Children usually react. He didn't, and that lack of reaction was more unsettling than a scream. Some began to fall silent without realizing it. The laughter lost strength. The judge adjusted his glasses. His face hardened again. He believed the matter was closed. The statement was on record, the contempt catalogued, the boy would be removed. But something in Noah's eyes suggested otherwise. There was no defeat there. There was calculation. Not childish but precise, and that created a discomfort that was hard to ignore. Cecilia opened her eyes slowly. She looked directly at Noah, and shook her head almost imperceptibly, not in reproach, but as a silent plea for him to stop, for him not to go any further. Noah saw it, understood it, and for the first time seemed to weigh the choice. But what came next no longer depended on laughter or authority, it depended on the truth that was about to be spoken. The laughter was still hanging in the air when Noah spoke again. This time his voice came out lower. There was no urgency. There was no nervousness, it was a tone that didn't match a child, that he didn't address the judge, nor the prosecutor, that he spoke while looking directly at the man in the wheelchair, as if he were speaking only to him, and that made the atmosphere shift instantly. Noah said there was no accident. The sentence was simple, short, no long explanations, no detours. Some people didn't understand right away. Others frowned. The brain needed time to process it. An accident was the foundation of the entire story. Without an accident, nothing made sense. And that was exactly why the statement caused discomfort. The man in the wheelchair didn't react immediately. His face remained still for a second longer than normal, a second too small for casual observers, too big for those who analyzed. His hands tightened slightly on the armrests, an almost invisible gesture. But Noah saw it, and continued, he said that paralysis didn't come from chance, it came from a choice, and choices leave traces. A murmur swept through the courtroom. This time it wasn't laughter, it was doubt, it was irritation. Some shook their heads in denial. Others whispered fragmented words, it was too absurd, a child accusing an adult man of pretending, or worse, of causing his own condition. But the more absurd it sounded, the more attention it drew, because no one had expected to hear that. Cecilia suddenly lifted her head, her eyes filled with terror. It wasn't surprised, it was pure fear. She knew what Noah was talking about, and knowing that terrified her. She tried to interrupt with a whisper. She said his name softly, almost pleading, but Noah didn't look back, he needed to finish that part. Noah explained there had been no impact, no collision, no fall. Nothing that justified that condition, he said it had all been induced. That word hit the courtroom floor heavily. Induced. Some didn't know exactly what it meant, but they understood it wasn't an accident. The judge leaned slightly forward, his expression changed. This no longer sounded like mere contempt. The man in the wheelchair cleared his throat, tried to laugh, but the sound came out wrong, forced. He raised his hand, asking to speak. The judge didn't grant it immediately, he wanted to see how far this would go. Noah noticed the movement, but he wasn't intimidated. He said the paralysis had a cause, and every cause has a method, and a method can be explained. The prosecutor shifted in his chair. The smile was gone. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but hesitated. Any intervention now would look like fear, and the courtroom could feel that. Noah kept speaking calmly, like someone recounting something studied, not learned from books, learned in silence, learned by watching too much. Cecilia began to cry openly now. There was no more restraint. The tears fell heavily. She knew that path had no return, if Noah continued, everything would come out, things buried for years, things she tried to protect, even from him. The courtroom watched that reaction closely. Mothers don't cry like that over someone else's lies, they cry over dangerous truths. The judge struck the gavel once more, called for order. But order had already been broken. The main accusation had just been threatened, if there was no accident, there was fraud, or something worse. The silence that formed now wasn't uncomfortable, it was expectant. Everyone wanted to know how a child knew this, and more importantly whether he could prove it. And that question opened the path to a confrontation no one there was prepared to face. The reaction came fast and loud, it wasn't silence, nor restrained doubt, it was open outrage, overlapping voices, heads shaking in disapproval, it was more comfortable to believe all of it was invented, a desperate child trying to save his mother. That explanation eased consciences, made everything simple again, and simplicity was what the courtroom wanted to regain. Someone in the gallery muttered that it was cheap theater. Another said they were wasting precious time. The word manipulation surfaced in the air, whispered at first, then repeated. The atmosphere turned against Noah, like a body rejecting something foreign. He felt it immediately. The pressure increased, but he didn't retreat. The judge raised his hand, asking for silence, but his tone was different now. Less patient, more irritated. He said he understood the child's emotional distress, used those words carefully, like someone trying to appear humane, but made it clear that this was not evidence, it was just narrative, and narrative absolves no one. His look said, "This is over." Noah listened without blinking. Each word landed like added weight. He realized they were building an exit, an elegant way to shut it all down. Label everything as childish imagination, an emotional mistake. Something understandable but invalid. That was the trap. And he knew it. He knew that if they accepted that version, everything would be lost. including his own mother. Cecilia tried to speak again, but she was cut off. Her voice had no space there anymore. She was the accused. Anything she said would sound like rehearsed defense. Her eyes searched for Noah's. There was fear, guilt, and a silent plea for him to stop, for him not to face this alone. But Noah didn't look away. That he seemed older than ever. One juror crossed his arms tightly, another let out a loud, irritated sigh. The child had gone too far, stirred too much. Now he needed to be contained. That was the general feeling. The courtroom began to close in again. Like a heavy door slowly moving shut, each second of hesitation favored closure, and Noah felt time slipping through his fingers. The prosecutor seized the moment. That he stood up with a firm expression. Said this was a clear case of emotional manipulation. That children learn quickly when they want to protect someone. That absurd stories arise from the fear of loss. That it was a convincing speech. Well rehearsed. The kind of argument that usually wins. Some heads nodded automatically. The official narrative was reassembling itself. Noah clenched his hands tightly. His nails dug into his skin, but his face remained calm. That he realized they were about to silence him for good. Not with shouting, but with disbelief, and that was more dangerous, because no one argues with what they don't take seriously. The judge straightened the papers on his desk. A clear gesture of imminent closure. The critical moment had arrived. Cecilia was crying now without trying to hide it. The handcuffs seemed heavier. She knew that chance was unique, and that it was slipping away. Noah took a deep breath. Like someone making a final decision. That he didn't need to convince everyone. That he only needed to crack the certainty of a few. And for that, ordinary words wouldn't be enough. The next step would require something different. Something a poor child should never know, but did. The prosecutor walked a few steps forward. That he didn't approach Noah by accident. That it was a strategy. To shrink the space, impose presence. That he looked the boy up and down, the worn shoes, the simple clothes. The contrast was glaring, and he used it without shame. The question came loaded with contempt. He asked where Noah had learned those things. The tone wasn't curiosity. It was irony. That he spoke about the boy's social condition. About lack of access. About the absence of formal education. That he implied that someone had put those ideas in his head. Maybe his own mother. Maybe some opportunistic adult. That it was a calculated attack. Not on the words but on the source of the voice. The courtroom reacted with an uncomfortable silence. Some felt ashamed. Others found it justified. That it was easy to agree with the prosecutor. Poor children don't master complex terms, they don't understand medical causes, they don't challenge structures. That was the unspoken belief, and it hung heavy in the air. The prosecutor knew it, and exploited every second. Noah slowly lifted his eyes. There was no rush. No shock. That he had been expecting that question. Maybe that was exactly why he was there, for that specific moment. His gaze showed no anger. It showed exhaustion. Like someone who had heard that before. Like someone who had grown up hearing it, and decided not to accept it anymore. The prosecutor kept talking. Said all of it was nothing but emotional theater. That the child was repeating memorized phrases. That he didn't understand what he was saying. That he was being used. Each word was an attempt to dismantle Noah. Not through content, but through identity. That if he were just a poor boy, nothing he said would matter. That was the message, and it hurt because it was familiar. Cecilia tried to move in her chair. She wanted to interrupt. She wanted to scream that the fault was hers, that Noah shouldn't be there, but her body didn't respond. She was trapped, handcuffed, silenced, and that was part of the cruelty. The prosecutor knew she was watching everything, knew that each word wounded twice over, and didn't care. The judge watched closely. That he didn't intervene. Not yet. That he knew that technique. That he had seen many defendants collapse like that, exposed, diminished, delegitimized. But something about that boy didn't fit. Noah didn't lower his head. That didn't defend himself with emotion. That didn't beg. That he simply listened. Like someone patiently waiting his turn. When the prosecutor finished, there was a brief silence. The kind of pause that precedes collapse. Or surrender. Many expected Noah to see RY.to fall silent. To finally be removed from there. That would have been the natural end. The humiliation had been public. On record, and sufficient. But Noah took a deep breath, and opened his mouth. His voice came out firm, without trembling, without haste. That he didn't answer the question directly. That he didn't mention school. That he didn't mention books. That he began by saying he learned by observing. Observing for years. In silence. While pretending not to understand. While people chose not to explain. While they assumed he wasn't capable, the entire courtroom leaned forward slightly. Something about that opening didn't sound like invention. Noah lifted his chin a little higher. His gaze was now on the prosecutor. There was no childish defiance there. There was something more serious. Something built over time. the kind of response that doesn't form in a day that it forms in survival. And in that moment the prosecutor realized too late, the attempt at humiliation had opened space for something dangerous. Because Noah was about to speak of things no one there expected to hear from a child. Noah didn't raise his voice when he began to explain that he also didn't look at the audience, that he spoke like someone organizing something inside his own head, that he started slowly, choosing simple words, that he said that certain paralyses don't come from impact. They come from interruptions. Silent interruptions, that leave no external marks. Some frowned, that no longer sounded like rehearsed language. He mentioned specific nerves, without difficult names yet. He explained how signals stop passing, how the body obeys the brain, and how, when something blocks that path, the legs stop. Not because of visible damage, but because of interference. The prosecutor crossed his arms, uncomfortable. That no longer sounded like a child's invention. It sounded like real understanding. Noah then went a step further. He spoke of substances that don't appear in common tests. Of small doses, repeated, controlled, enough to cause effects without raising suspicion. The sound of the room changed. Some people stopped moving. Others forgot to breathe for a moment. No one was laughing now. Laughter had lost its place, and that was noticeable. He explained that the initial pain can be mistaken for stress, that weakness appears gradually, that the person begins to accept the limitation, because they believe the version presented, accident, trauma, shock. Noah said this while looking at the man in the wheelchair, not as a direct accusation, but as a clinical description, and that coldness was even more disturbing, because children don't speak like that when they invent. The judge leaned forward again, the pen pressed hard against the paper. He was writing down terms, words that should not come from the mouth of a 10-year-old boy. The defense attorney began to sweat visibly. He ran a hand over his face, adjusted his tie twice in a row. Something in that explanation struck close to home. Too many details are uncommon in lies, and the courtroom was beginning to realize that. Noah continued, now talking about reversal. He said that if the cause were removed, the body would react. Not immediately, but in signs, spasms, involuntary contractions. Movements that someone faking paralysis wouldn't be able to control properly. A collective sigh passed through the room. It was an agreement. It was unease. Because that explanation made too much sense, and no one wanted to admit it out loud. The prosecutor opened his mouth to interrupt, but closed it again. Any cut now would sound like fear. Noah spoke with impressive calm, like someone who had repeated this in his thoughts for years, not to convince adults, but to understand his own world. This wasn't a presentation. It was a technical confession, and the effect was devastating. Laughter had completely died. Cecilia slowly shook her head, tears fell without control. She recognized every word, every detail, every pause. Noah knew more than she had imagined, more than she wanted him to know, and that terrified her. Not because he was wrong, but because he was too right, the kind of certainty that destroys silent pacts, even those made out of love. The man in the wheelchair began to move, not to speak, but to adjust himself. His body seemed uncomfortable. His hand gripped the arm of the chair tightly. His right foot trembled slightly. Few noticed, but those who did couldn't ignore it. The defense attorney turned pale. The judge raised his hand, calling for absolute silence. He had understood something crucial, and that understanding completely changed the course of the hearing. The courtroom was different now, not hostile, not skeptical, but attentive, dangerously attentive. Noah had crossed an invisible line. He had ceased to be the desperate boy, and had become an unpredictable variable. Someone who knew too much, and when a child knows too much, some adult has made a serious mistake. The next step would require authority, because what came next could no longer be treated as imagination. The call for silence came faster than before. It wasn't just authority. It was instinct. The judge sensed something wrong in the rhythm of the room, not in the sounds, but in the faces. The defense attorney had lost his color. His once rigid expression was now fractured. His hand trembled slightly as he held the pen, and that doesn't happen by chance. The judge stared at the attorney for a few seconds longer. Long enough to notice the sweat on his forehead, the nervous adjustment of his tie, the eyes avoiding direct contact. Medical terms usually confuse lay people, but that man didn't look confused. He looked recognized, like someone hearing something that should not be spoken aloud, and that triggered a silent alarm, the kind of alarm experienced judges learn to respect. The gavel struck sharply. Absolute silence was ordered, not as a formality, but as a necessity. The murmuring stopped immediately. Everyone sensed the change in tone. The judge was no longer dealing with an affront, nor with childish emotion. He was dealing with procedural risk, and risk demands control. The entire courtroom felt it. Noah stayed quiet, not because he was told to, but because he realized he had achieved something that he was observing now. Like someone yielding the floor to watch the reaction, his body relaxed slightly, not in relief, but in readiness that he knew that detail mattered, that the paleness wasn't fear of ridicule, that it was fear of the truth getting too close, and truth doesn't ask permission. The defense attorney cleared his throat, tried to pull himself together, opened his folder with unnecessary force. Papers scattered slightly that he bent down too quickly to pick them up. A small gesture, but revealing. Those who are secure don't rush like that. Those who control the narrative don't lose their footing over a child's words, the judge wrote in silence. Every gesture became data, every reaction a clue. The prosecutor noticed the shift in power. The focus had changed. It was no longer on Noah. It was on the defense, and that visibly bothered him. He tried to intervene with a side remark, but the judge raised his hand. Not now. The priority was understanding why those terms had caused such impact, and that question hung in the air, unspoken, but felt by everyone. Cecilia stopped crying for a moment, her face still wet, but her gaze alert. She knew that attorney, she knew how he behaved when he was in control, and that wasn't control. It was contained panic. She clenched her handcuffed hands tightly, her heart raced. Noah had touched something she had tried to hide even from herself, and now it was too exposed to be ignored. The judge adjusted his glasses with calculated calm. He looked at Noah again. This time not as an interruption, but as a source. That changed everything. He asked if the boy had anything more to say. The question was simple, but the weight was enormous. The courtroom held its breath, because that implicit permission opened space for something irreversible, and Noah realized that immediately. Noah nodded his head, not with enthusiasm, with responsibility. Like someone who understands the cost of what comes next. He cast a quick glance at his mother. Cecilia looked away, not out of shame, but out of fear of the next step. She knew that if Noah continued, there would be no going back. The judge waited, the defense attorney avoided looking forward, and that imbalance said more than any words. The silence now wasn't imposed. It was respected. Everyone felt that something serious was about to happen. The kind of revelation that changes who sits where, that turns accusers into defendants. Noah took a deep breath once more. The next thing he would say wouldn't attack a stranger. It would attack a pact, a secret kept for years. And that secret was directly tied to his own mother. Something even she didn't imagine he knew. Cecilia understood before anyone else. Before the judge, before the prosecutor, before the gallery. She recognized the exact point where everything had crossed the line. This was no longer a childish attempt to save her. It was no longer an emotional impulse. Noah knew too much, and that too much came from a place she had tried to seal for years. Her face lost the little control it had left, her breathing became short, uneven. Desperation appeared without asking permission. She shook her head more forcefully now, not as simple denial, but like someone silently begging. Her eyes searched for Noah's with urgency. There was fear there, not of the courtroom, but of what he was about to expose. Cecilia had always believed she had protected her son, that certain truths would never reach him, that silence was a form of love, and in that moment she realized she had failed. Noah noticed his mother's reaction. He saw the panic in her eyes. But he didn't stop. His body grew tenser. Not from insecurity, but from inner conflict. He didn't want to hurt her. He never did. But he knew that was the price, and high prices don't ask permission to be paid. His gaze contained pain, the pain of someone who chooses truth even when it wounds. Cecilia tried to speak. The sound came out weak, broken. An incomplete word. A plea that never formed. The judge noticed the attempt. But he didn't interrupt Noah. Something told him that reaction was part of the evidence. Dangerous criminals tend to maintain control. Cecilia controlled nothing now. She was falling apart in real time, and that said far more than rehearsed speeches. Her handcuffed hands trembled visibly, the metal clinked softly, producing a dull sound. Every small noise seemed amplified. The gallery watched in absolute silence. No one moved. No one dared to cough. The focus was on her now. On the woman the prosecution had painted as cold, but who was unraveling in front of her son, that didn't match the role assigned to her. And that inconsistency was beginning to unsettle people. Noah looked away for a second, perhaps the only moment of hesitation. He took a deep breath, as if searching for strength where none existed. Then he looked back at the judge. The decision was made. He couldn't stop halfway. Not now. Cecilia realized it, and the desperation grew. She began to cry uncontrollably. There was no longer any attempt to maintain dignity. The mask had completely fallen. The prosecutor shifted in his chair. That reaction hadn't been part of the plan. It wasn't strategic. It was far too human. And humans off script disrupt proceedings. He tried to interrupt, but restrained himself. The judge watched everything with surgical attention. Every gesture from Cecilia was being mentally recorded, the kind of record that doesn't fade afterward. She didn't look like someone acting. She looked like someone reliving old choices. Choices now knocking at the door. Cecilia squeezed her eyes shut tightly as if she could erase what had already been said. But memories don't obey orders, they return when they want to, and Noah was bringing everything to the surface, things said in whispers, things done in the dark, things justified as necessary. She had always believed silence would protect her son. Now she realized silence had only delayed the collision. And the collision had arrived in that courtroom. The judge rested his elbows on the bench, his hands clasped together. His posture had completely changed. There was no rush to end things anymore. There was interest in understanding. And understanding requires letting someone speak. That he didn't take his eyes off Cecilia. Then he looked at Noah again. Something was deeply wrong in that dynamic. Mothers don't fall apart because children invent stories. They fall apart because children tell inconvenient truths. And that realization was beginning to spread silently through the room. Noah seemed to feel the weight of the moment, but he didn't retreat. That he knew that point was irreversible. That he knew that after this, nothing would be the same again. Not for him. Not for his mother. Not for those who believed they controlled the story. The courtroom was about to discover not just a fraud, but the reason for a silence kept for years, and that reason was directly tied to Noah's next step. Something he had promised never to reveal, until now. Noah took a deep breath before speaking again. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was a physical necessity. Like someone carrying something far too heavy in his chest, his voice came out lower than before, and yet firmer. That he said he had known many things for years. That he said it without pride, without heroism. That he said it like someone confessing a burden. He said he learned early to stay quiet, not because he was told to, but because he understood. That he understood the fear in his mother's eyes. That he understood the long pauses in conversations. That he understood the strategic silences. Children notice more than adults imagine, and Noah noticed everything. But he chose to stay silent. That he stayed silent out of love. That he stayed silent to protect. The courtroom absorbed those words slowly. Years of silence are not something small. Not something of an ordinary child. That it's the mark of someone who grows up too fast. Noah explained that he didn't ask questions. That he observed. That he didn't accuse. That he stored things away. Every strange gesture. Every interrupted conversation. Every abrupt change of subject. Everything piled up inside him. Like pieces of a puzzle he never wanted to assemble. Cecilia began shaking her head again, but now it wasn't desperation. It was recognition. She remembered the moments, the sleepless nights, the half-explanations, the "I'll tell you later." And she realized too late that he had understood everything. Maybe not every detail, but enough. His silence wasn't ignorance. It was a conscious choice, and that devastated her. Noah said he accepted that silence as part of life, that he believed he was doing the right thing. Protecting his mother was his priority. Even when he didn't understand everything. Even when he felt afraid. Even when he felt guilty for knowing too much. That he said he believed it would never leave the house. That no one else would be involved. That everything would remain contained in that small world. But then came the day of the arrest. And everything changed. When he saw his mother handcuffed, something broke. It wasn't immediate anger. It was disbelief. The sense of injustice was stronger than fear. He said he didn't recognize that scene. The woman who protected him being exposed as a monster. People pointing, calling her a dangerous criminal, and no one knowing the full story. The silence that once felt like protection turned into betrayal, not against others, but against her, and that was unbearable. Noah explained that, in that moment he understood that staying silent was no longer love. It was cowardice. That protecting didn't mean hiding forever. It meant choosing the right moment. And that moment had arrived. That he didn't want to destroy his mother. That he wanted to save her from the bigger lie. Even if it cost the silent pact between them. Even if it changed everything between them. His eyes showed pain. But also resolve. The kind of resolve that doesn't turn back. The prosecutor tried to shift in his chair, but didn't interrupt. Perhaps because he realized this was no longer an argument. It was testimony. The judge kept his eyes fixed on Noah, without blinking. That account didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded lived. Long silences create premature adults, and Noah was proof of that. The entire room felt the weight of that revelation. It was impossible to pretend otherwise. Cecilia was crying silently now. There was no more denial. No attempt at control. She understood exactly what her son was talking about. Every word was a painful mirror. She had always thought she hid everything well. Now she saw she had only shifted the weight onto him. And that guilt was greater than any formal accusation. She brought her handcuffed hands to her face, like someone trying to hide from herself. but there was nowhere left to hide. The judge wrote something long on the paper. Not technical terms, impressions, the kind of notes that determine outcomes. That he realized that prolonged silence wasn't accidental, that it was strategic, and strategies involve adults. They involve agreements. They involve interest. A child doesn't sustain silence for years alone. Someone benefited from it, and that question was now open in the courtroom. Dangerously open. Noah finished by saying he didn't choose that day by accident, that he chose it because he saw his mother being judged for something incomplete. For a story told halfway, and half-told stories always condemn the wrong side. That he no longer wanted to carry that alone. That he didn't want to sleep knowing he could have done something. Silence had been useful until then. But in that courtroom, in front of the handcuffs, it stopped being protection. It became injustice. And that shift pushed everyone toward a point of no return. The next step would involve other people. People who, under no circumstances, wanted to be exposed. The doctor's name was announced with formality. Brian entered the room with confident posture, steady steps, neutral expression, the kind of presence trained to inspire credibility. That he sat before the court like someone who had been there before. That he didn't seem nervous, that he seemed prepared. The prosecution treated him as a key piece, and that was clear in the respectful tone used with him. Brian began by confirming the report. He spoke of permanent paralysis, of irreversible causes, of a consolidated diagnosis. He used technical terms with ease. The testimony flowed like something already repeated many times. The prosecutor nodded discreetly. Everything followed the expected script. Until Noah asked to speak. He didn't raise his voice. He simply asked, and the judge allowed it. Noah asked a simple question. So simple that some almost smiled. He asked how long Brian had been treating the patient. The doctor answered without hesitation. Then Noah asked if he had been present at the onset of the condition. Brian took a second longer before answering. He said no. That he had taken over the case later. The courtroom didn't react. It still didn't seem important. But Noah noted it mentally. The next question was even more basic. Noah asked which tests had confirmed irreversibility. Brian listed a few names, standard tests. Noah nodded. Then he asked whether any of them detected progressive chemical induction. The doctor blinked twice, said it wasn't common. The answer came out less firm. The judge slightly raised an eyebrow. The gallery sensed the first crack. Noah didn't accuse. He didn't raise a direct hypothesis. He simply asked whether, in such cases, other tests would be necessary. Brian answered yes. But quickly added that there were no indications. The correction came too fast. Like someone rushing to close a door. Noah then asked whether those tests had been performed. The doctor took a deep breath before answering. He said no. Because there was no reason. And that sentence echoed differently in the courtroom. Noah tilted his head slightly. Like someone who understood something important. He asked whether it was possible to claim irreversibility without investigating all possible causes. Brian began to explain. The answer stretched too long, circular phrases, vague terms, nothing direct. The judge took notes. The prosecutor shifted in his chair. Something was slipping out of control. The doctor no longer seemed so confident. And that wasn't normal for a technical witness. Cecilia watched in silence, her eyes fixed on the doctor. She recognized that discomfort. She had seen it before in other contexts. Noah continued. He asked whether small repeated doses could alter neuromotor responses without leaving immediate traces. Brian swallowed hard, said that theoretically yes, but quickly tried to downplay it. The word theoretically hung in the air, because theories in courtrooms often turn into investigations. The judge interrupted for the first time. He asked the doctor to be objective. Brian nodded too quickly. His voice was higher now, less controlled. Noah asked the last question of that sequence. He asked whether someone might have an interest in keeping that diagnosis unquestionable. The doctor opened his mouth, closed it, then replied that it wasn't his place to speculate. The evasion was too clear. And the silence that followed was heavy. The prosecutor tried to end the testimony, but the judge didn't allow it immediately. He stared fixedly at Brian. He no longer saw just a specialist. He saw someone trying to sustain an incomplete version. Noah didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply waited. He knew he didn't need to go further at that moment. The contradictions had already surfaced, and once seen, they don't disappear. Brian discreetly ran a hand over his face. The gesture revealed strain, not of someone who talks too much, but of someone who says what he shouldn't. The courtroom felt it. The credibility of the report had been shaken, not by aggressive attack, but by questions too simple to hide behind answers. Noah had done something dangerous. He had turned a solid witness into an unknown. And that shift pushed the hearing into even more unstable territory. Because now it wasn't just a child speaking, that it was an expert. Contradicting himself in front of everyone. The silence after Brian's testimony was broken abruptly, not by the judge, nor by the prosecutor, but by a sharp sound of metal scraping. Lucian moved violently in the chair, his face until then controlled, twisted, the vein on his forehead pulsed visibly that he slammed his hand hard against the armrest. The noise echoed far too loudly for someone supposedly immobile, and everyone heard it. Lucian began to shout, his voice came out hoarse, loaded with fury that he demanded that it stop, called everything a farce, said it was absurd to allow a child in that space. The words came fast, stumbling over each other, his body followed the loss of control, his torso leaned forward, his shoulders pushed ahead, short movements but real ones. Movements that did not match total paralysis. The judge partially rose from his chair, the gesture was instinctive, something there was too wrong to ignore. Lucian tried to restrain himself but failed, his right hand gripped the armrest tightly, his fingers contracted at a small detail, but impossible to unsee. Some jurors exchanged quick glances. Others held their breath. The wheelchair no longer looked like just an object, that it looked like a fragile disguise. The prosecutor tried to intervene, asked for calm, called Lucian by name in a controlled tone, but the man didn't listen. That he pointed toward Noah, his arm shook with rage, not weakness. Indignation took over. That he demanded respect, demanded the boy be removed, and the more he spoke, the more he exposed himself, because someone truly paralyzed does not project forward like that without assistance. Cecilia's eyes widened. That it wasn't surprised, that it was confirmation. She recognized that behavior, she had seen it before. In moments of lost control, panic crossed her face, not fear of the man, but of what it meant. Lucian was making an irreversible mistake, and doing it in front of everyone. The mask was beginning to fall. Noah remained still. That he didn't retreat, that he didn't react, that he observed. Like someone who had been expecting exactly that, his gaze followed every movement, every contraction, every attempt to interrupt. That he didn't need to say anything now. Lucian's own body was speaking, and it was saying things no words could erase. The entire courtroom felt it. The judge struck the gavel forcefully, ordered Lucian to calm down immediately, but the order came too late. The damage was already done. Attention was no longer on the voice, that it was on the movement, on the imbalance, on the visible effort to restrain himself. Security moved closer as a precaution. Not to protect Lucian, but to contain what might come next, because something there had gone out of control. Lucian realized, too late, the stairs. That he tried to compose himself, slumped back into the chair, took a deep breath, lowered his tone, but his body didn't obey as quickly. The damage was already recorded, not in the transcript yet, but in everyone's memory. The silence that returned was heavy, not with embarrassment, but with concrete suspicion, and suspicions changed destinies. The prosecutor tried to reclaim the narrative, spoke of emotional reaction, of extreme stress, of reflex movements. But the explanations sounded weak now. Reflexes don't obey orders. They don't repeat themselves under the command of anger. And someone in the gallery murmured something that echoed like a silent sentence, that if he can't walk, how can he move like that? The question wasn't answered. But it didn't need to be. It was already planted. The judge was writing quickly, this time without hiding the gravity. His eyes never left Lucian. Not for a second. The hearing had crossed a critical point. That it was no longer about what Noah said. That it was about what the accused himself showed. And that couldn't be undone. Lucian had tried to interrupt the court, but ended up interrupting his own farce. And that rupture opened the way to a public collapse that no one there would be able to control. The heavy silence was broken by Noah's voice. There was no tremor. There was no haste. That it was a calm that contrasted with the latent chaos. That he asked to speak once more. The judge hesitated for a brief moment, but authorized it. Something suggested that stopping him now would be worse. All eyes turned back to the boy, and the air seemed to shrink. Noah said he wasn't there to shout, nor to accuse without proof. That he said he had a proposal. The word echoed strangely through the courtroom. A proposal is not something expected from a child. Much less in that context. A murmur ran through the room. Lawyers shifted in their seats. The prosecutor frowned. Lucian gripped the arms of the chair tightly. Noah said he would make a public deal. There. In front of everyone. No side conversations. No closed doors. That he said the deal wouldn't benefit only him, nor only his mother. It would benefit the truth. That word triggered immediate reactions. Some laughed nervously. Others tensed up. Truth is rarely welcome when it arrives uninvited. The prosecutor tried to interrupt. Said it was absurd, that there was no room for improvised deals. But Noah kept speaking. Not to the prosecutor, but to the judge. That he said everything there had already gone off script. that pretending normality would be dishonest, that everyone had seen too much, too many movements, too many contradictions, and pretending nothing had happened would be choosing a side, and not the right one. The courtroom began to stir, voices rose, some indignant, others curious. Chaos settled in waves. The judge struck the gavel several times, trying to restore order. But the proposal had already been launched, and proposals once heard cannot be unheard. Lucian began to sweat visibly. His rigid face now showed cracks. Noah said the deal was simple. Too simple to ignore that he didn't detail it yet, and that pause was strategic. That it created expectation, that it created fear, that it created curiosity. The entire room waited. Silence slowly returned, not by authority, but by interest. Everyone wanted to know how far that child would go, and exactly what he was putting on the table. Cecilia slowly lifted her head, eyes swollen, heart racing. She didn't know what Noah was talking about, and that terrified her. That he had never mentioned any deal, never spoken of a plan. She realized in that instant that her son had gone beyond her, beyond what she had imagined, and that mixed pride and fear in equal parts, the kind of mixture that hurts in the chest. The judge asked Noah to explain better. His voice was controlled, but there was tension there. That he needed to understand the risk. That a public deal could dismantle everything. That it could also expose serious failures, and the judge knew it. Noah nodded, said he would explain, but only if he were heard until the end, without interruptions, without laughter, without attempts at silencing. The prosecutor objected, spoke of procedural order. Of legal limits, but the objection sounded weak. The hearing had already gone off the rails, and the judge realized it. That he looked at the jurors, then at Lucian, then at Noah. That he made a silent decision. That he allowed the boy to continue. The room reacted with a mix of shock and expectation. Noah took a deep breath, looked around. There was no fear in his eyes, there was focus. That he knew this was the moment, the only one. That the deal he was about to propose would leave no one comfortable, and precisely because of that it would work. The courtroom was on the brink of collapse, and collapses reveal truths that rigid structures hide. The next step would require institutional courage, because accepting what Noah was proposing meant taking a public risk. A risk that would change everything from that point on. The judge took a deep breath before speaking. It wasn't a tired sigh. It was a quick calculation. He assessed the room, the faces, the accumulated tension. The hearing was already beyond traditional control. Denying it now could look like fear. And fear in a courtroom weakens authority. So he authorized it with caution, with coldness, like someone allowing something while expecting it to fall apart on its own. In the judge's mind, that would be the end, the final embarrassing scene, the child going too far, failing in public, proving in front of everyone that it was nothing more than childish imagination, the kind of situation that closes debates, that disarms sympathy, that restores control to the institution. He believed that, and that belief shaped the tone of the authorization. A tone that sounded permissive, but carried veiled contempt. The judge made it clear there would be no interruptions afterward, that this would be the limit. He said Noah would have a chance. Only one. Some interpreted it as generosity. Others caught the subtext that it was an elegant trap. A way to expose the boy to a final ridicule. To end the emotional narrative, and move forward with the conviction. The judge believed he was offering Noah a stage for his own failure. The prosecutor relaxed slightly in his chair, the corner of his mouth almost moved. He understood it the same way. Letting the child speak would be the final blow. After that, any doubt would seem exaggerated. The prosecution would come out stronger. Lucian breathed a little easier, still tense, but confident that this would be the end of the nightmare. He thought nothing else could surprise him, and that was the mistake. Cecilia felt her heart drop. She didn't share that reading. She knew her son. She knew when Noah spoke on impulse, and she knew when he spoke with certainty. That authorization didn't sound like victory. It sounded like danger. She tried to move again, tried to call his name, but the sound died in her throat. She was trapped not only by the handcuffs, but by a decision she could no longer stop. Noah heard the authorization without any visible reaction. He didn't smile. He didn't thank anyone. He simply nodded, like someone confirming something expected. He didn't see it as permission. He saw it as confirmation that they were underestimating him. And underestimation had always been the greatest mistake of the adults around him. His body straightened, his posture shifted subtly. Not in defiance, but in execution. The room seemed to hold its breath. Some expected tears. Others expected confusion. Others expected awkward silence. No one expected precision. No one expected control. The judge adjusted his glasses again, ready to end it the moment something went wrong. He believed he was in command of that moment. But control had already changed hands, and he hadn't realized it yet. Noah took a small step forward. Nothing theatrical. Nothing exaggerated, but enough to mark his position that he looked at the judge, then at the prosecutor, then at Lucian. Each look lasted exactly the right amount of time. As if confirming pieces on a chessboard, the courtroom watched in total silence. Because, whether they liked it or not, everyone wanted to see the outcome of that audacity. And that alone was already an unexpected victory. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair, convinced it would be quick. In his mind, that authorization would be remembered as tolerance. As patience. Not as a mistake. That he didn't imagine he was about to allow something irreversible. Something that could not be erased from collective memory, something that would make that courtroom remembered for years, and Noah, standing there, seemed to know exactly that. The deal was about to be executed, not as a proposal, but as living proof. Noah didn't say anything at first. That silence was calculated. That he knew everyone was expecting words, explanations, impactful phrases, but he chose the opposite. That he knelt slowly in front of Lucian. The gesture was simple. Nothing theatrical. Nothing defiant. And precisely because of that, unsettling. Lucian instinctively pulled his torso back. The movement was too fast. Another one. Noah lifted his gaze, calm. He asked only that no one interfered. He didn't look at the judge when he asked. That he spoke like someone who already had implicit authorization. The judge didn't respond. Because he didn't know exactly what to stop. The entire courtroom seemed suspended in time. Noah reached into the pocket of his own pants. The gesture was small, but it produced an immediate effect. Chairs creaked. Someone held their breath. Nothing came out that was visible from a distance. Nothing spectacular. That he simply brought his hand closer to Lucian's body, without touching right away. Like someone waiting for the right moment. Like someone who had tested this before, and that sent collective chills through the room. Cecilia screamed his name. Her voice came out broken, desperate. But it was too late. The judge struck the gavel, calling for order. But no one moved. No one dared to interrupt. It was as if everyone knew that if they stopped it, they would never know what was about to happen. Noah placed his fingers on a specific point. A point no one there recognized. But Lucian recognized instantly. Lucian's face transformed, not in pain. In panic. His eyes widened, his breathing accelerated. He tried to push Noah's hand away, tried to scream, but the sound came out broken. His body began to react erratically. A short spasm ran through his right leg. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but far too real to ignore. The courtroom didn't react immediately, because no one understood what they had seen. Some thought it was an illusion. Others thought it was a reflex. But Noah didn't remove his hand. He merely adjusted the position slightly, carefully, like someone who knew exactly what he was doing, and then it happened again. This time, more visible. Lucian's foot moved, not much, but enough to break something irreversible. Lucian began to hyperventilate. The wheelchair creaked as he tried to stand on impulse. His body didn't fully obey. But it also didn't remain still. It was an impossible in-between, the kind of reaction that wasn't in any report. The judge rose abruptly. His authority now didn't come from his position. It came from shock. He ordered that everything be recorded, everything. Because what had happened could not be undone later. Noah slowly removed his hand. He didn't celebrate. He didn't look at the gallery. He looked only at Lucian, and said in a low, almost gentle tone, that this was just the beginning. That sentence froze the blood of those who heard it. Because it made clear that the effect was not random. It was expected, planned, executed. Lucian began to beg, not for help, but for Noah to stop. And that plea was the exact moment when the impossible began to become undeniable. The chaos didn't come in screams. It came in absolute silence. No one knew how to react. Jurors exchanged looks in shock. The prosecutor seemed unable to form words. Dr. Bryan watched with a rigid expression. Because he understood exactly what he was seeing. And what he was seeing had no simple explanation. Not in that context. Not in that way. Noah had done something that should not have been possible. And that placed the courtroom before a brutal choice. Accept what they were seeing. Or pretend it didn't happen. Lucian was crying now, not from pain, from fear. A raw, animal fear. He knew his body was betraying the lie, and that he could no longer control it. Noah stood up slowly. The gesture ended the execution. But it didn't end the effect. Because something had been activated there. Something no judge, prosecutor, or lawyer would be able to undo, and the next moment would demand immediate answers. Answers no one was prepared to give. Lucian tried to cling desperately to the arms of the chair. His body no longer obeyed as it had before. Something had been awakened, and he felt it with terrifying clarity. The muscles in his legs contracted irregularly, not enough strength to stand. But far too much movement for someone paralyzed. His face twisted in absolute panic. The kind of panic that can't be faked, the kind born when a lie begins to collapse. He pushed his body forward without realizing it, his torso lifted a few centimeters, the chair creaked under the involuntary effort, his right foot pressed against the floor more firmly. It wasn't a step. But it was the intention of a step. And intention was already too much. A muffled scream escaped his throat. It wasn't pain. It was terror, the terror of losing control of his own disguise. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, not laughter, not outrage, pure shock. Some people stood up instinctively, others brought a hand to their mouths. The judge stood still, completely frozen. He knew that moment would go down in history, because no one there was witnessing a miracle. They were watching a farce unravel in real time, and that was even more disturbing. Lucian began to beg, his voice came out trembling, childlike. He begged Noah to stop, repeated the plea like a desperate mantra, said something was wrong, that it was hurting, but it wasn't physical pain. It was psychological panic. The kind of panic that comes when the last line of defense disappears. Noah watched in silence, his gaze serious. No pleasure whatsoever in that collapse. Cecilia let out a loud sob, her hand went straight to her chest. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Not because it was impossible, but because it confirmed everything she had feared for years. Lucian had never been the victim. He had always been the manipulator, and now he was exposed in front of everyone. She felt her body weaken. If she hadn't been seated, she would have fallen. Relief came mixed with guilt and shock. Lucian tried to support himself on his own knees, his fingers pressed down hard, his legs trembled violently. They didn't support his weight. But they reacted far too much. The prosecutor stepped forward, confused. Then stopped. He no longer knew what role to play. Defending that now seemed impossible. Denying what their eyes saw was choosing blindness, and no one there was willing to do that. Dr. Bryan brought a hand to his chin, his gaze fixed on the movements. He understood what was happening. He understood that the reaction wasn't caused by suggestion, nor by acting. It was a real neuromotor response. Something that only happens when the cause is removed. Even if partially, even if temporarily. His face showed shock and fear, because it dismantled the entire report he had signed. Noah took a step back, not out of fear, but to show he was no longer touching him, that Lucian's body was reacting on its own now. That was crucial. The judge realized it immediately. Nothing could be attributed to direct interference anymore. What was happening came from within, and that changed everything. Lucian kept begging. His words tangled together. He asked for someone to be called. Anyone. As long as Noah stopped looking at him that way. The silence returned, heavy. But now it was a silence of collective understanding. The lie had been laid bare, and fear had replaced arrogance. Lucian sank back into the chair, gasping, sweating, broken. He knew he wouldn't be able to sustain it much longer. His body no longer obeyed the old script, and the entire courtroom could see it. The impossible had happened before everyone's eyes. And now all that remained was to discover why, and who else was involved. The judge didn't call for silence this time. He simply waited, and the silence came on its own, heavy as concrete. Everyone knew there was no turning back. What had happened there wasn't an isolated incident. It was consequence, and consequences pull threads. Threads lead to knots, and knots reveal entire structures hidden for years. The truth was beginning to impose itself without needing to shout. Lucian tried to speak again. His voice came out weak, fragmented. Nothing of his former authority remained. The judge cut him off with a sharp gesture. Now the court was speaking. He ordered the financial records to be brought in, recurring payments, disguised transfers, non-existent medical consultancies. Everything began to fit together too quickly, like pieces that had always been there, just out of sight. The prosecutor turned pale upon hearing the amounts. Large sums, frequent, incompatible with any ordinary treatment. Dr. Bryan lowered his head. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it. But his silence said everything. The paralysis wasn't permanent. It never was. It was maintained. Controlled. An expensive performance sustained by fear and money. Cecilia began to understand her own role in that machinery, not as a villain, but as a target. The accusation against her was part of the plan. It served to keep her silent. To isolate her. To threaten her. If she spoke, she would lose everything, including her son. The desperation she had carried for years now made sense. She wasn't an accomplice. She was blackmailed, and that difference changed everything. The judge asked Noah to explain how he knew all this. The question came with respect now. Noah answered simply. He said he heard conversations, that he saw hidden documents, that he noticed patterns, that he understood too early that man needed to appear fragile in order to control everyone around him. The wheelchair wasn't a limitation. It was a shield powerful enough not to be questioned, until now. Lucian began to cry loudly, Not out of remorse, out of collapse. The mask had fallen, and without it, there was only an ordinary man left, desperate. Small that he tried to justify himself, spoke of business, spoke of protection, spoke of necessity, but no one was listening anymore. When the truth arrives whole, excuses become noise. The courtroom reacted in waves, first disbelief, then indignation, then contained fury, not only toward Lucian, but toward everyone who had allowed it. Report signed without verification. Fast-track proceedings. A woman handcuffed to sustain a convenient lie. The system began to look at itself in the mirror, and the reflection is not always pretty. Cecilia brought her hands to her face, but for the first time she wasn't crying out of fear, she was crying out of relief. The weight of years was beginning to shift. It wasn't over, but it had changed places. She looked at Noah with a mix of pain and pride that he had done the unthinkable, not for revenge, but for justice, and justice is rarely born clean. The judge ordered Lucian's immediate arrest for procedural fraud. But he didn't stop there. He ordered a full investigation to be opened. Doctors, lawyers, intermediaries. Nothing would be spared. The courtroom that had once laughed now trembled. Because they realized they hadn't been spectators, they had been part of the problem. And that weighs more than any direct accusation. Noah remained silent. That he didn't celebrate, that he didn't seek applause, that he knew that wasn't the end. That it was only the complete revelation of what had always been hidden. The truth had surfaced. Raw, undeniable, and now everyone there would have to live with it. But something was still missing. There was still the moment when the court would have to choose who would leave in handcuffs, and who would finally walk free. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted sides. That it wasn't gradual, that it was abrupt, like a door slamming shut. The same people who had laughed before now avoided eye contact. Lawyers adjusted papers without knowing why. Jurors sat unnaturally rigid in their seats. Laughter had turned into silent shame, because now they knew, and knowing changes everything, especially when it exposes those who chose to ignore. The judge scanned the room with his eyes. That he was no longer seeking order, that he was seeking accountability, that he knew this hearing was not ordinary, that he knew previous decisions would need to be revisited, and that the entire court was under invisible scrutiny. When truth explodes in public, it spares no audience. The weight of what had happened there fell on everyone, and the collective silence was proof of that. There was no way to pretend neutrality after what had been seen. Noah asked to speak once more. There was no hesitation. The judge authorized it immediately. No gavel. No formality. The boy took a deep breath, and for the first time his voice carried something beyond control. That it carried restrained emotion. That he said he waited because he had to. Not because he wanted to. He waited because speaking sooner would have destroyed everything, including his own mother. He explained that the man only felt safe when he was in control, when he believed no one would dare confront him. The wheelchair gave him that protection, power, silence around him. Noah said that if he had spoken earlier he would have been discredited, just as he almost was there, but he needed everyone to see. To doubt first. To laugh, because only then would the shock be impossible to deny, and he was right. The boy said he had observed for years, that he waited for the moment when Lucian believed himself invincible, the moment when he would lower his guard, when he would agree to expose his body, the report, the farce in front of everyone. That courtroom was the perfect stage, cameras, authority, official record. Nothing could be erased afterward. Waiting was strategy, not cruelty. And that revelation silenced even the most skeptical. Cecilia listened with silent tears. There was no more desperation. There was belated understanding. She understood why her son endured so much. Why he remained silent. Why he didn't try to resolve it earlier. That he was protecting more than her. That he was protecting the truth from disbelief. And that cost him years of childhood. The courtroom felt that weight. Children should not carry plans like that. But some are forced to grow up far too early. The prosecutor lowered his head, not in formal defeat, but in silent acknowledgement that he had laughed, that he had underestimated, that he had followed the easy script. Now he saw the mistake. The entire court saw it. When a child has to wait for adults to fail in order to be heard, something is deeply wrong, and that realization was impossible to ignore. It hung in the air like a mute accusation. Noah finished by saying he didn't want revenge, nor applause, nor fame. That he wanted complete justice, for his mother, and for anyone crushed by a well-dressed lie. That he said he waited because he knew that, on that day, no one would be able to say they didn't see, that they didn't hear, that they didn't notice. The truth had been public, and public truths do not return to the dark. Those were his final words. And they fell like an emotional verdict. The judge remained silent for a few long seconds, then nodded slowly. That simple gesture sealed something greater than the case. The court was no longer judging just a crime. It was being judged as well. Why the choices made. Why the earlier laughter. Why the ease with which disbelief came. And that internal judgment was harsher than any formal sentence. Noah sat back down. His body looked tired now, not from fear, but from delayed relief that he had done everything he needed to do, waited for the right moment, and used that moment with precision. The courtroom was ready for the final outcome. Not as spectacle, but as repair, and the silence that formed signaled that the final decision would not be only legal. It would be moral. The judge stood up slowly. There was no haste in the gesture. It was a movement heavy with meaning. The entire room followed in absolute silence. Not because anyone asked, but because no one dared to break that moment. The decision was clear even before it was spoken. When truth fully asserts itself, the sentence merely confirms it. The judge declared Cecilia's immediate release. And those words changed the weight of the air in the room. The handcuffs were removed with a sharp metallic sound. Cecilia closed her eyes at that exact moment. As if she needed to confirm it was real, her marked wrists trembled. Not from fear, but from delayed release. She took a second before standing up. Her body still didn't believe it. When she finally stood, she searched for Noah with her eyes. There were no words enough for that moment, only presence, and that was enough. Noah remained still for a moment. As if absorbing what had happened. Then he ran to his mother. It wasn't a cinematic gesture. It was human, awkward, urgent. Cecilia knelt to reach him. The hug was too tight, too painful, too necessary, the kind of embrace that gives back years lost in seconds. The courtroom watched without interrupting. No one there had the moral authority to break that. Behind them, Lucian was being handcuffed. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The man who once hid behind the chair now tried to lean on those passing by. There was no more protection. No more shield. The wheelchair was left empty, abandoned. A common object, with no power at all. His footsteps echoed down the corridor. Heavy, not with admitted guilt, but with public downfall, and falls like that don't make noise, they deafen. The prosecutor watched in silence. There was no closing speech. No attempt to save face. Some battles allow no justifications. The judge ordered the immediate forwarding of complementary investigations. Other names would be called. Other reports reviewed. Nothing would end there. But something essential had already been resolved. The main injustice had been reversed. And that changed everything. Cecilia held Noah's face with both hands. Her gaze carried guilt and pride at the same time. She whispered something no one heard. Maybe an apology. Maybe a thank you that words couldn't contain. Noah simply nodded. Like someone who understands too much for his age, they stood up together. Side by side. Not as winners, but as survivors of something that should never have happened, and that distinction mattered. The courtroom remained silent even after the final gavel. There was no applause. No comments. The initial laughter had vanished completely. What remained was a heavy emptiness, the kind of silence that forces reflection. Everyone there knew they had been part of something larger, and that not all wrong decisions come from bad intentions. Some come from carelessness, from prejudice. From the ease of disbelieving those who seem too small to tell the truth. Noah looked one last time at the center of the room, not with anger, not with pride, but with something close to farewell. That he knew that place would be marked forever. Not as a stage of humiliation, but as the place where the impossible happened, where a child was heard too late, but still in time. That he held his mother's hand tightly, and together they walked out. Each step was light, not because the past had been erased, but because the future was no longer handcuffed. The judge remained standing for a few seconds after everyone had left, watching the empty room, the abandoned wheelchair, the papers on the desk, the pen lying still. That he knew that final silence would weigh more than any written sentence, because it would remind everyone for a long time that the court laughed, and that laughter almost cost an entire lifetime. In the end, it wasn't the verdict that made the most noise. It was the silence. The silence of those who laughed too early. The silence of those who realized too late. The heavy silence that remains when a well-sustained lie collapses in front of everyone. This story isn't just about a courtroom. It's about how many times we disbelieve someone simply because they seem too small to tell the truth. About how many injustices survive because trusting the system feels easier than questioning it. How many Cecilias are still in handcuffs because of badly told stories? How many Noahs are silent right now, waiting for the one moment when they will finally be heard? And if you had been in that room, would you have laughed too? If this story made you reflect, comment below what shocked you the most. Would you have the courage to stand up to an entire system for the truth? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because stories like this need to be told, especially when the world would rather laugh at them.